The Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome, everybody, to the latest edition of our Provoke Media podcast. I am joined today by Emily Thomas from Brands to Life and Chris Carter from Coopervision. And we are going to be discussing the topic of business-to-business marketing. In particular, we're going to be focusing on some research that Brands to Life has conducted around what we're calling marketing in transition, which seems to be both always relevant and particularly relevant. We're all talking, I think, about how the pace of change is accelerating, and that's true in the B2B marketing realm as much as it is in the rest of the world. And we'll be looking at the results and some of the findings of that survey and just getting a sense for, in particular, how business-to-business marketers are finding ways to balance long-term brand building with the immediate impact of their campaigns on the sales funnel. And let's start quickly by just introducing ourselves. So, Emily, why don't you tell people a little bit about your background?
Thank you, Paul. Nice to be here. So my name is Emily, and I am the Managing Director of Health at Brands to Life. And I had a team there where we really focus on the intersection between health and technology, looking how we can help support brands to tell their stories, build their brands, and enable them to really lean into their sort of more of commercial goals as well as communication goals. But my career is being predominantly agency for the last 25 plus years. I've worked for a number of the big global network agencies, as well as a period in-house at Bayer. And yeah, very pleased to be here with you today.
And Chris.
Yeah, so I'm Chris. Also great to be here. Senior Global Marketing Director, currently in the contact lens world, but have travelled a number of different industries from toilet paper to frozen food to the aesthetics industry before landing back here in contact lenses. So I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Emily, why don't you start by just telling us a little bit in general terms about the research, what you've been looking into, what surprised you about the findings?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So Brands to Life really, we really try and position ourselves as quite a transformative agency, working with clients who are disruptors in their field, and that could be through technology, through innovation, or through purpose. And recognizing we're at a real point of change in terms of marketing and digital and technologies, we wanted to explore how the environment were impacting marketers and communicators. So we conducted a survey amongst 200 CMOs and CCOs earlier this year to really look at what are the big challenges that they're facing, and specifically in terms of brand, how they're starting to utilize new channels, how they are embracing AI. And I think what was really both encouraging but eye-opening was how far that many of the CMOs and CCOs are in terms of recognizing that the world around them is changing from a comms and marketing point of view, and that really there is no looking back over their shoulder. They fully embracing the fact that they need to change and to be agile with the way that they're working, and to also to bring their organizations on this journey, that it can't just be limited to the marketing or comms department when they're thinking about new technologies and new channels. So I think that was really encouraging. I think perhaps the part that's slightly more sobering is just the enormity of the challenge, and the pressure that many of these chief communications officers and marketers are feeling in terms of the job that's to be done. They're being confronted at all sides by needing to upskill their teams, potentially bring in new technologies, and also take their sort of management on the journey with them. And that's quite a challenge. And I think particularly, given our focus of the discussion today around sort of brand awareness, one of the stats that stood out for me certainly was that 53% of CMOs are finding balancing brand awareness or brand building and lead generation is their biggest challenge that they're facing today. And I think that's partly reflective of the kind of macroeconomic climate that we're feeling at the moment. But trying to find that right balance is a real tug of war, and certainly something that came through strongly in the research that we did.
Right. I'm wondering, Chris, whether that particular finding resonated with you. Is that something that you wrestle with, on a daily basis in your job? Is that kind of tension something that is inevitable in a B2B marketing context? And how do you find the balance in that space?
Yeah, it's an interesting statistic. I'm surprised. I was surprised by it when I saw it. If we really boil marketing down to its core function to begin with, which is around creating profitable demand, right? That's what our department is here to do. Quite shocking that 53% of CMOs are wrestling with that challenge between. Ultimately, lead generation is one of the tools of creating demand. So, a little bit surprising to see that. Wrestling with it, long term versus short term. I think within the marketing mix, there's the activity needs to sit across both. If you only do short term demand generating activities, you take your eye off the ball. Longer term, if you only focus on the longer term stuff and not on the short term demand generation, then you don't have a brand or a business to wrestle with in the future. So, first reaction was just one of surprise that so many marketers seem to wrestle with the fact that creating demand is part of their job.
Is that a fair interpretation of the results, Emily? I'm just wondering whether they're really wrestling with it, or whether it isn't just the fact that this is a continuum, right? And sometimes the pressure is on to focus on, oh my God, we need more demand today to hit our quarterly numbers. And then sometimes it's like, okay, we can invest a little more in the future. And that slider is always moving from one end of the continuum, perhaps not to the other end, but further towards the middle. And the constant changes in that are what marketers are wrestling with. And maybe, and again, I say this without being immersed in the world the way that the two of you are, maybe right now there is so much pressure because of economic conditions on lead gen that marketers worry that the brand building part of it is falling by the wayside.
Yeah. I mean, I think
like a reasonable.
Yeah, in absolutely. I think that's really the kind of the heart of the stat is that for sure every marketer and comms person goes into their role knowing that ultimately they are the guardians of their brand and they are part of the kind of growth engine as well. But I think at this point in time, it is that balance between how much time and attention and resources that they can put into brand awareness, brand building, which, as we know, is a more of a longer term play, to alongside lead gen and demand creation, which one hopes will drive more short term outputs or performance. And I think that's really that kind of the heart of the wrestle that Chris referred to. It's just getting the balance right. And certainly from an agency point of view, we often find that some of the sort of resources, if you like, are gated by people who don't necessarily want to understand that brand building can take years in reality, and they are driven by quarterly returns and a balance book that doesn't want to wait years, and the pressure that then is exerted upon them to prioritize lead gen and demand creation is where that kind of tension comes in. But as Chris suggested, that if you don't look after your brand, in the long term, then you haven't actually got anything left to do there. So I think this is kind of the heart of the matter here. It's just finding that right balance. And obviously, I think a lot of your listeners will be aware of research that Les Bennett and Peter Field did about the balancing short and long term activities, and how it's proven that over the longer term, it's far more effective to make sure that you're looking after your brand consistently over a period of time. And whilst it's very tempting to kind of withdraw from supporting the brand when times are a bit tighter, ultimately it doesn't play out in the long run, which is really tricky. And I'm sure we've had to navigate those conversations multiple times, both with clients or stakeholders or different internal parties who are kind of needing to see. And even ourselves in the agency world, I don't think it's any secret to anybody to know that it's a bit tighter out there at the moment, and even our own internal audiences are saying, where's the pipeline, and what does that look like? And so we have to grapple with that as well, in terms of building the longer term Brands Alive brand, as well as making sure we're doing things that can convert in the short term as well.
Yeah, I wonder, Chris, if the issue here is less about marketers finding that balance difficult and more about the people that marketers answer to having very, very sort of specific demands about one or the other. And particularly thinking in terms of both company leadership and sales, whether the pressure isn't mounting from those places to focus more on immediate lead gen. And that's what's creating the headache for people in positions like yours. Does that sound plausible? And how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think most marketers would resonate with what you've just said at some point or another. And as Emily talks about, that short term, demand need and lead generation that arguably is very quantifiable, and you can prove it out very quickly in terms of measurement, that therefore answers to the, let's call them the money makers on the inside of the or the money owners and money drivers inside the business. It's an easy, tangible conversation to have. I think one of the challenges, or one of the challenges, opportunities that marketers have to get control of that dialogue internally, really plays back to what you measure and over what time period you measure it. A lot of brand building activity, and by brand building activity, really I'm talking about brand awareness, right? Brand awareness, understanding of the proposition to your target audience. And tracking that over time. I think one of the things that marketers don't necessarily measure enough of are those brand equity measurement, and consistently doing it year in, year out, that therefore builds the case and shows the impact of more brand building, more brand equity building activity. Now, when you look at that, ultimately what you're trying to do is to shortcut the decision-making process and to drive the efficiency of your lead generation in the short term. I'd rather have 10 really good quality leads that I can execute 6 of than have 100 average quality leads, of which I only execute 6 of. So the brand building activity over time, really helps shortcut the decision making. And one of the challenges, as Emily talks about, even the internal challenge of trying to fill a pipeline from an agency point of view, from her perspective, she really wants clients in a place in the future whereby, as project work comes up, the shortcut decision to select agency A over agency B is taken in a heartbeat, rather than overly thinking about it at that point of need. So really, I think, solving the issue or managing the issue really comes back to what you measure, but consistently measuring over time. So you see the impact, ultimately see the impact of brand building activity.
I did wonder, when I was looking at the research, how much of this came down to measurability. And the ability to directly link impact to marketing activity. And lead gen I'm going to be reductive because I'm a journalist and it's in my nature, right? But so grossly oversimplified, lead gen is something that you can track immediately and see the impact of. And it's a fairly short line between campaign activity X and lead gen impact Y. The line between campaign activity X and brand love, affinity, recognition even can be a much longer line with much more interference along the way and many more external impacts on it. And so to a certain extent, it's much easier to measure and be confident in stating that the lead gen was because of the campaign than it is to say the same thing about long-term brand impact. And I wonder whether the relative simplicity of the latter of the former rather, doesn't make it more of a priority. I'm not sure that I'm stating my question as clearly as I could, but is it much easier to figure out the lead gen impact than it is the brand impact? And is that a reason that lead gen gets prioritized?
I don't think it's so. I think it's easier to prioritize lead gen or to justify lead gen when you're starting. I think once you're into a cycle of measurement, it's not necessarily any easier or any harder. For example, project forward 3 years, right? If you've been managing on brand equity, brand equity tracking over 3 years, looking at key measures around, does my proposition, resonate? Are the attributes that I'm seeking to understand, are they moving positively in a direction? Is willingness to consider, willingness to purchase on a brand, are those metrics moving in a positive direction? Once you get into a data set of continual update, then that becomes one part of the jigsaw puzzle to look at in terms of marketing effectiveness. For sure, it's harder at the beginning. You need to take that leap of faith to execute on brand building and the measurement and the cost associated with measuring as well, right? It's not always a cheap thing to do, but as a marketing function, that investment in learning is super important, as it helps us drive better strategic thinking that ultimately drives to better tactics. And I think when you're just in the world of looking at lead generation in isolation of anything else, big question around quality of lead generation comes up. I can generate lots and lots of leads, but how good is the quality of those leads? How long is the conversion time from lead coming in to actually concluding on a product purchase? And I think it's just one view of what is a more complex view, or it's a narrow view of a much broader set of data that we should be looking at as marketers to help drive, again, then that right balance between where we invested.
I think that's just picking up on a couple of the points that Chris referenced in terms of, conversion cycle and length of time. I think that it's easy to underestimate the value of brand initiatives to help enable that, because if you haven't got the awareness already, if you haven't got a good brand reputation, or your audience don't have the mental availability to even consider you, then when lead generation sort of activity lands up on their, invariably some sort of digital format, the way that it would be received would be completely different than if you had done that brand building activity in parallel. So the effectiveness is not always as simple as the kind of the immediate metrics, because it's much more of a subtle influence, but they really should go together, because together, yes, you get the short and the long term, but you also get the impact has a much stronger halo if you are doing that brand building work in parallel as well. And that's the tricky part, because it's much more intangible. And as we've already talked about, you're not necessarily going to see that in the numbers immediately. And also, just recognizing that having that commitment to do the brand tracking is something a lot of brands don't feel that they have the resources to do, and so that's often feels out of sort of reach, even though it might be something they'd like to do in an ideal world.
Yeah, it's something I could just pick up on that. It's something that I feel very passionate about. That the marketers should be investing in learning, right? Marketing, we can boil marketing down to a very simple function at the end of the day, right? But we need to learn. Learning drives strategy. Strategy drives tactics, and then as we're deploying on tactics, we go back into the learning cycle again, and it's a virtuous circle. That learning piece is so critical. I just wanted to pick up on something else you said, Emily, which I thought was good, which is interesting. Let's not forget that the next component of brand building and effective brand building, right, allows us to operate at a higher level in on the emotional benefit ladder, right? And once we operate in the emotional benefit ladder, right, that helps us drive price in our product, and that's ultimately really, really important as well. In the absence of brand building work, okay, and we're just in straight lead generation without really having driven proposition in the minds of our audience, we end up in a feature fight, and when we're in a feature fight, it's a race to the bottom of the price ladder. So equally important point to look at.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a moment, because I think that's a really interesting discussion about particularly the sort of proper use of PR in the mix here. But I want to come back to where we started the discussion, really, and this idea that there is an inevitable tension between these two things. And I'm always reminded of the work that Jim Collins did years ago. He the guy who wrote In Search of Excellence, or co-wrote In Search of Excellence, had this wonderful idea of the tyranny of the or and the genius of the and. The idea that we have to escape the idea that there's some sort of false choice between doing A and B, and find solutions that accomplish both A and B at the same time. And it seems to me that smart marketers should be able to come up with campaigns that both generate leads and build brands, right? And but it's easy for me to say, how difficult is that in the real world? And how much time do you spend thinking about whether what you're doing does both, rather than one at the expense of the other?
I think the digital age that we now live in has meant that the and is a much more of a likely scenario, whereas back in the day, when you're particularly driving through earned media, it was much harder to do that, because you were more restricted to kind of more of a print media or traditional media, whereas now it's much more intuitive to be able to blend the two. So if you're creating thought leadership content, or some content of value that your audience will kind of respond to, then to be able to make sure that it's targeted to the right audience, and has some sort of call to action that is going to start to then feed your sort of more at the bottom end of the funnel. It becomes a much easier step now. And I think we've all been talked about top of funnel and bottom of funnel, and where brand building is typically at the top of the funnel, but I think that shape has got much more fluid now, and the step between it is much closer as well. So I think that the channel choices that we now have available to us, much more immediacy in terms of you can write something and it's up within minutes or hours, and the steps that you're not asking somebody to click through or visit a different space or place. That is now just one click away now. So I think that immediacy of the digital environment means that it's much more of an easier step, and it is and certainly something that we are increasingly asked to think about by our clients is instead of it just thinking about a piece of content for one channel only, we think about how we can create content and sweat it over as many different channels and in different ways as possible. And yes, it may start in the earned space, just purely because often that's demanded of us by journalists, that they want content that's not being published elsewhere. But then that you can think about how you use it in other ways. So we're always thinking about what's the strategy and what's that kind of value that we can add that would really take the piece of content or the work you're trying to drive in more places.
What do you sort of see in that arena, Chris?
I 100% agree with what Emily has just said. The tool, the tools, the digital execution today allows for much greater personalization. Also allows us to be much nimbler in changing what works, in changing what doesn't work, should I say? And I think with execution and executions in the digital space in particular, and even looking at the multiple channels within digital, you just have to work a little bit harder to drive the right authenticity in communication. But brand building and lead gen can both live perfectly happily alongside each other in that space. Very much agree.
I think it's also something that communicators are really starting to put a lot of effort and focus in getting it right. I think we've all been through probably some painful periods where you just become content creators and we're creating loads of stuff, and then you realize that actually it's not getting the engagement that you're wanting, because there are numerous stats, aren't there, about the amount of content that's out there and the amount of the stuff that feeds that scrolls through your feeds. So stickiness is becoming more and more important, and therefore it's about having better quality of thought leadership that's really adding value. So I think that people are starting to understand that you need to add value to get value, and making sure that if you're going to spend the time and effort on creating something, that equally puts the onus on. You might spend a bit more time and therefore a bit more money on creating something, therefore making sure it works really hard across all your channels is even more important to show the return that you get.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Like quality in, quality out. Draw me in with a narrative, tell me a story, and at the end of that story, lead me down the path that you want me to go down, versus perhaps some of the more rudimentary executions of, hey, look at me, buy me, which are a little too much at the transactional end. So I totally agree with that.
Are there any specific campaigns that you can think of that sort of balanced this well, that accomplished both?
I mean, I think, I work in the health world. Well, we both work in the health world. So I think, there are some good examples for, I think some of the insurance companies the health insurance companies do this well. The Vitality or Bupa's of the world, where they're really taking on more of from a thought leadership brand building point of view, in terms of protecting you, helping you protect your health, and really building understanding of the role of preventative health. But then equally closely parallel to that, they're creating content that enables you to understand, what be that I don't know, heart age calculators or things like that genuinely tie into the brand building thoughts that they've developed, or maybe it's around heart care or something like that. So it shows that natural link. And I think it's to Chris's point, you have to resist the temptation for lead gen to be about functionality and closing the sale. You have to still go through the courting stages. So if you make sure that you're still adding value, but in a way that is going to draw your audience in, so they're going to spend time on your website or in a space that is curated by you, then you're more likely to take a further step and ultimately towards the purchase. So I think some of the healthcare brands actually are doing it really well, and clearly coming off the back of COVID, where we are all sort of driving a stronger preventative healthcare message and personalized healthcare message. There's quite a few brands who are doing that and taking that opportunity.
And where does corporate reputation fit into all of this? Is that something that you see as virtually synonymous with long-term brand building or complementary to long-term brand building? What's the ideal relationship there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's complementary, but it can't do the job, and it can't exclusively do the job of brand building. And the reason why I say that is really when you think about the target audience. I mean, corporate reputation, picks up on a much broader audience, and corporate PR picks up on a much broader audience than perhaps targeted brand work does. And within the portfolio of a business, you may well have multiple brands, and many businesses do have multiple brands that have different jobs to do for a different target audience, and so that brand building work has to be targeted at the audience that you're trying to influence. You take a step back, the corporate reputation. As I said, those audiences go broader, right? Corporate reputation's got a job to do for employees. It's got a job to do for investors. That goes beyond just perhaps your purchasing audience. So I liken it a little bit to it can provide air cover, but it can't ultimately do the job that the infantryman on the ground has got to do.
Yeah, no, I was also going to try and to give some sort of metaphor about it helps to create some of the mood music is one of the sort of the ways that we like to talk about it, so that when you deliver more some of the brand activity, you're already feeling positively predisposed towards a particular brand because you might have a sort of a certain affinity. But I think also to Chris's point, often depending on, I know we're sort of more talking a B2B conversation, but sometimes the connection between even the corporate brand and the brand is not always as immediately clear. If you have sort of more of a house of brands that sort of, I guess, brand architecture. So and actually that's often something that we are being asked to help to close that gap now, because the power of the master brand inevitably enables you to do things that the individual brands can't do, and so to try and ensure that you're really harnessing what that master brand can do is certainly the types of topics or the types of things that you can talk about are broader and arguably more impactful.
And I think it's important, right? The corporate brand is important. Where products come from, the values of an organization, what they stand for, how they behave, the things that they do, in society, are all they're all important must-haves within a corporate, big corporate. But they just can't do the job that the individual brand needs to get done ultimately at the ground level.
Yeah. I think as well, just picking up on that, back to your point about the world that we live in now, where both businesses are needing to demonstrate their credentials from a sustainability point of view, from an employee point of view, and also consumers and customers are also demanding that. If you don't have a point of view, if you don't have a story, and if that's not known, you're automatically making your job harder for you.
I want to come back to sort of what Chris was saying a little while ago about sort of the long-term emotional investment that customers have in brands and building that kind of relationship with consumers that obviously has long-term benefits. I think when I started writing about public relations, the conventional wisdom among PR people was that was what we were really good at. But that came with a sort of side implication of, so don't hold us responsible for sales impact. But I get the feeling that that's changed over the years, and certainly a lot of the work that we see in awards competition now is measured to a certain extent in sales impact, often very short term. we drove a 7% increase in sales over the same 2-week period last year, which always seems to me to be somewhat unsatisfactory in terms of relationship building, even if it's important in terms of sales building. But how do we feel about PR's place in the overall mix of disciplines that marketing uses, and whether PR is better suited to one of these things than the other, or whether it should, PR agencies should be looking to do both? What are your expectations, Chris?
I was wondering which one of us might go first on that one. So I think PR. So everything you say is absolutely correct. I think PR's role within the mix sits more at the brand narrative. It sits more at the brand building side of the spectrum than it does necessarily at the short-term sales impact. And that's not to take anything away from PR's role within the mix, because at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe in any activity we do as marketers, right, we're playing with a set of tools and different tools that we dial up and we dial down in order to ultimately drive behavior and create profitable demand in the market. But PR sits more at the reputational, at the brand building, at the narrative end of the spectrum than it does in the harder short-term sales end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would agree that PR is, we like to think of ourselves as sort of storytellers, and whether the channel that you're using that is earned media or other types of media. I think also the definition of PR has slightly blurred in terms of it is becoming much more integrated and without that same degree of separation that it once perhaps had. But inevitably, yes, I agree that PR is very much about that, driving the reputation, so that when there are other digital initiatives that can then really take advantage of that kind of awareness that PR has helped to stimulate, it pushes you further along. So I like to think that PR certainly, back to your original point, Paul, in terms of measurability, it's hard to do it by itself, but if we can work closely with other kind of marketing colleagues, and that happens more often than certainly it used to. It does not always, but it's certainly more and more. It means that we can demonstrate the value of PR far more effectively than perhaps in the past, where we were sort of more limited to reach impressions and share a voice analysis and things like that. So hopefully that PR can be part of that kind of conversation now too.
Do you have preferred metrics for PR, Chris, and what are they?
Good question. I would say it's well, a good question. At a general level, no. I would say when I look at when I look at it from a sort of a year-over-year perspective, I'll look at attributes. I will look at attributes around call it brand love, if you like, authenticity. Attributes that talk to my brand's profile and personality, and am I shifting the dial on those in a positive direction over time? When we drop down to specific campaign levels, we'll look at certain metrics, but I'll tend to look at a campaign in its entirety and measure against a few metrics that cover multiple channels rather than necessarily calling out one particular channel over another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's harder to have that real separation now for attribution to be solely at the door of a particular sort of marketing discipline. But I mean, inevitably, there are the share of voice or the sentiment analysis and things like that, the messaging pull through that you can consistently deliver across PR. But then if you can couple that with other marketing metrics, then that's where it starts to become a more powerful combination.
Yeah, and I think the one thing we can all agree on is that the term integrated has become almost unnecessary, because why would you not be that, right? I mean, it's the default now. I remember when 30 years ago, people were getting excited about the idea of integrated marketing communications, but today it's pretty much table stakes, right? That you're working with other disciplines, and each of you has a role within the overall campaign and the overall brand strategy, and it's a cumulative impact that matters.
For sure. I think that there's a lot more appreciation that your audience is one audience. They don't differentiate, so neither should we. But there are the occasional swim lanes which are a little bit too defined, and therefore there's still room for improvement. But overall, I think totally that's the direction of travel, and everybody's appreciating that that's the better way to operate nowadays.
100%.
Great. Well, thank you very much. As I said, fascinating topic, great research. Brands to Life found a lot more interesting things that we didn't discuss here, partly because I'm AI'd out and findings on how we're going to be using AI in the future.
There's plenty more on our website, Paul, so you can go and dip in whenever you next fancy.
Were very interesting, but I thought this was a little different and not so predictable as a topic of discussion. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks, Emily, for the research. Thank you, Chris, for agreeing to be part of this conversation. Enjoyed it very much.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Provoke podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.